Great. Well, welcome very much to this joint Canadian Industrial Relations Association and Canadian Association of Work and Labour Studies webinar looking at the labor relations of COVID vaccine workplace mandates. It's obviously a very hot topic at the moment, very top of mind, and so we're very excited to have two very knowledgeable people to walk us through this a little bit and engage us in a bit of a conversation. I'm Jason Foster. I'm the president of the Canadian Industrial Relations Association. In the audience as well is Larry Savage, who's the president of the Canadian Association of Work and Labour Studies. And as I say, we're both happy to be jointly sponsoring this. We will be doing this webinar in English, so apologies to our Francophone colleagues. We're trying to figure out options for sort of translation, but those could be kind of complicated. So we thought for today we would just stick with English. And our apologies to those of you who are French is your first language. Before I introduce our speakers, I just want to sort of indicate that given the nature of this subject, there is an expectation today that everyone in their participation will be respectful and will sort of maintain sort of a professional and collegial atmosphere. We want this to be a safe space for discussion. And so we will, if someone starts to engage in personal attacks or starts to engage in inappropriate behavior, we will take action to make sure that this space remains a safe one for everyone to be able to talk about this subject. So without further ado, we hope this to be sort of an hour or so. We'll see how the conversation goes, but so to get you back on your day, we know that people don't like spending too much time on Zoom, so we're going to try and keep this nice and tight and efficient. So I'll introduce both of our speakers right at the top, and then we can just go one to the other when they're done speaking. So our first speaker is Alison Braley-Ratai. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Labor Studies at Brock, where she mostly teaches labor and employment law and policy. And she also happens to be, lucky her, the grievance officer for her faculty association. And our second speaker is Troy Winters. He's a certified registered safety professional, and he's the senior health and safety officer for the Canadian Union of Public Employees, the largest union in Canada, with approximately 700,000 members. Through his work at the national office in Ottawa, Troy assists local unions and their staff with health and safety related issues and concerns, as well as shaping broader health and safety policy for the union. Troy also sits on numerous international, national, and provincial committees and working groups, including the chair of the Canadian Standards Association Strategic Steering Committee for Health and Safety, and he's also the vice chair of multiple standard development technical committees. So a very deep well of knowledge around issues around occupational health and safety. So without further ado, I'll hand things off to Alison to get us started, and then when Alice is done, you'll be able to hear from Troy.
Thank you very much, Jason. And of course, thank you to CIRA and CAWLS for jointly hosting this and for having me here today. Good afternoon to all of you. It's 12:06 my time here in Ontario. As it's my birthday, I guess I get to go first. So here we go. The first thing I guess I want to highlight in these comments that will probably take 15 or so minutes is that looming over this entire discussion is the absolute rarity, of course, of vaccine mandates in any context, really. And the fact that for the vast majority of us, the idea of vaccination as a condition of work was certainly, at least until the pandemic, a completely foreign idea. I'm sorry, you might be able to hear my dog barking in the background. My apologies for that. I can't make him stop. However, vaccine mandates in the workplace have certainly obviously attracted a lot of attention, which is of course why we're here today. And that's true since really the start of the COVID vaccine rollout back in December of last year. There was a lot of initial commentary, mostly regarding the likely legality or not of mandatory vaccination in the workplace. There are, of course, numerous kinds of vaccination mandates or policies that can apply in various contexts. But consistent with today's webinar and the focus of today's webinar, my comments will be relegated to workplace vaccination mandates as they apply to unionized workers, which is a very different context than how they might apply, for instance, to non-unionized workers. I also want to talk a little bit about what the introduction of these mandates might comport for the future of labor relations, not just union management relations, but also possibly union member, union leadership relations as well. So despite the initial commentary about the legal implications of vaccination policies, these policies themselves were really slow to follow. And we didn't really start seeing these until much more recently. We're talking like, late August, September is when we really start to see them in earnest. And up until that point, unions, as well as employers and governments, not just unions, but unions were really mum about vaccine mandates. There was a kind of collective wait and see, I think on the part of unions, employers, and even governments, people crossing their fingers and hoping that vaccination uptake, would be high enough and, sufficiently robust that there would really be no need to wade into these muddy waters at all. But here we are, of course, at the tail end of the fall, and there has been something of a sea change in that regard from that initial wait and see, which was, in my view, always a bad strategy doomed for failure. From that initial wait and see to being sort of squarely in the fray, right, with employer vaccination policies popping up in numerous workplaces, and with unions having to, of course, respond to these in various ways. And in some cases, of course, unions were the instigator of these policies. It's not that they've only responded to them after they've been imposed by employers. There were some contexts in which unions did instigate them. So I want to talk for just a very short minute about vaccine mandates from an employer's perspective before getting into where I plan on spending most of my time today, which is talking about the union responses, as well as what we can take away from this whole thing. So the employer really has two main considerations, right? The obvious one is health and safety, the health and safety, of course, of its workforce. And the second consideration are various business or operational considerations. And from the health and safety perspective, there appear to be some very good reasons why an employer would want a vaccination policy in place. The most obvious one is, of course, the employer's legal duty to take every precaution reasonable to protect the health and safety of its workforce. And I don't want to spend, of course, a lot of time here because Troy will be able to detail the occupational health and safety aspect much better than I am able to. But suffice it to say that an employer has a clear interest in avoiding an outbreak in their workplace. If there was an outbreak, for instance, and that workplace did not have a vaccine mandate, it may be that the employer is found after the fact to have violated their legal duty because, we have readily available, safe and effective vaccines. Sounds like a perfectly reasonable precaution. No, why didn't you have one in place to potentially mitigate this, outbreak that, we've now seen? So there's, a good health and safety legal duty reason for why employers might want a vaccine mandate. And there are also some, fairly straightforward business or organizational considerations. For instance, an employer may want to be able to assure its clients or its customers that, all of its workers are fully vaccinated. It may want to assure the workers themselves that their co-workers are vaccinated, particularly since, the vast majority of those workers quite willingly undertook the vaccine. The vaccination uptake is still, quite high. Even if it's not high enough, it's still quite high. And the majority of people, of course, have undertaken to get vaccinated. So although I don't know the numbers specifically on this, it's a pretty safe inference from what we do know that a strong majority of workers want to be working in an environment where they know that their colleagues, for the most part, are also vaccinated. So clearly the employer's interest here, the health and safety interest and, some of their business operational considerations, those are actually consistent with what we would expect to be in the interest of most unions as well. The health and safety of their members, obviously, and being responsive to their members whom, like I said earlier, we can probably assume, at least very generally, want to be working in an environment where they know that their colleagues, for the most part, are also vaccinated. And I think those things really raise what for us are the central issues for today, which is first, why were unions playing, for the most part, a wait and see game rather than taking a leading role in urging vaccination policies, although some did. For the most part, it was a wait and see game. Also, what are unions' responses to vaccine mandates that they did not necessarily instigate? And what implications do these responses have that can provide, some takeaways for us moving forward? So with regard to kind of the wait and see, I think what we did see was some initial advice from some quarters that suggested that unions should be very careful about agitating for vaccination policies, particularly mandatory vaccination policies, because that might make it more difficult to then represent members if and when the members ran afoul of these policies. Now, I have to admit that personally, I never really thought much of this piece of advice. In fact, I struggled a little bit to understand it. Even though the current situation is novel, right? Of course, the pandemic is a novel situation, and vaccine mandates in the workplace are an extraordinary rarity, or at least they were before the pandemic. The basic, mechanics of labor relations and labor law and labor law principles do provide us with some direction here. So in some ways, despite the novelty of the situation, in some other ways, a vaccination policy is not really any different from any other kind of policy. Agitating for a policy does not mean that you can't grieve the policy you eventually end up with, either in whole or in part, because unions can grieve policies with which they disagree. And even accepting a policy, even in its entirety, doesn't mean that you can't grieve its application in a particular instance, right? Perhaps someone got denied an accommodation that they were entitled to by law because they had a sincere religious belief, and you want to grieve the employer's decision to not give them that accommodation. That's all perfectly possible, even if you agitated for a vaccination policy in the workplace. And of course, that's the kind of thing that unions engage with and do every day. So on one hand, even though we're dealing with a novel situation, on the other hand, we're actually, we have these sort of basic principles that can guide us, and that a vaccination policy is in some ways not very different from any other kind of policy. So, I don't want you to get me wrong. I think that there was room, especially early on, for some serious legal uncertainty about what all this, meant, what the legal implications were. But I do think that a lot of the general legal uncertainty was really a smokescreen for political uncertainty. And I think that's true not just of unions, but also of employers. It was very easy to not know what you should do politically, and therefore to take refuge under this idea that, well, you didn't even know if you could do it legally. And so I think it acted as a bit of a cover for a while. Now, either way, whether instigated by unions or not, vaccine mandates have clearly proliferated, and unions eventually were required to respond to them. Even if by taking a public position, even if by not taking a public position one way or the other. Some unions have not taken a public position. We don't really know what they think about these policies or what they might do if one was introduced in their workplace. But of those that did publicly articulate a position, I think we can divide those positions into roughly three kind of categories. So you have the one category whereby unions are actually favoring a mandatory policy. And this would be a really kind of robust policy, one that required vaccination, with the exception of those who under human rights law could get a legitimate accommodation. So we're really talking about like medical need and religious belief, because those are the bases under the human rights regime for which you could get an accommodation. And then you have the sort of second position, and I think this is actually where most unions live right now. They're in this second position, which is that you favor a voluntary policy, which would mean that no one has to get vaccinated, but that everyone who isn't would have to be regularly tested, for instance. Or maybe you would agitate for them to be able to work remotely and then not have to come into contact with any of their colleagues. So that's kind of a voluntary vaccination policy. Some people are getting vaccinated, but those who don't want to, for whatever reason, would either do testing or may be able to work remotely, or maybe continue to work remotely if that's what they've been doing. And then we have this third position, those that say it's simply not the employer's business to know their employees' vaccination status one way or the other, period. Now, of all these various positions, like I said earlier, I think unions, for the most part, seem to be taking, the second position, basically, saying that some kind of voluntary vaccination policy is okay, but we don't want like a mandatory policy that would only allow accommodation for people on religious or medical grounds. But I think this raises the question for us, which is that if unions and employers even seem to have a really common interest here, worker health and safety, and the idea that the majority of workers probably want to work in an environment where they know that others are vaccinated. If that's true, and I think at this point that's probably true, why are unions taking this sort of tepid, middle of the road approach? Why aren't they taking sort of a more robust approach, if you will? And I do think that there are a few possibilities that suggest themselves. In fact, I note right now that myself and my colleague Larry Savage have just embarked upon a research project that's meant to ferret out the answer to that very question of why have unions decided to do this as opposed to doing this. That's still in its infancy. So for now, what we're really dealing with here, I think, are various possibilities that suggest themselves. And I think one possibility that suggests itself is sort of a straightforward concern about having to defend against what we call a DFR complaint. DFR stands for the duty of fair representation. And as I'm sure most of you know, all unions owe a legal duty of fair representation to everyone. And that means that they have to represent them, without arbitrariness. You can't just arbitrarily decide on a position or not vis-a-vis a particular member who wants you to take a case forward for them. You can't be discriminatory, and you can't exhibit bad faith. And for the most part, unions who have adopted, what I'm calling the middle of the road approach appear to be trying to do a kind of balancing act between, on one hand, strongly trumpeting health and safety, right? They're saying things like, yes, vaccination is good, and yes, we encourage everyone to get vaccinated. No one's going around saying, it's a hoax or anything of that nature. On the other hand, they're also trying to adequately represent what, in essence, is a minority of their members, because it's really a minority of the membership that don't want to get vaccinated. And then, of course, they would do this by proposing alternative measures like, testing or remote work, for example. Importantly, I think, it's really fair to say that the duty of fair representation does not mean that you have to adopt each position that any member would want you to take. That's not what the duty requires you to do. And even if that's the case, however, it doesn't mean that unions want to have to face this kind of complaint. So, there might be some interest in, taking a kind of middle of the road balancing approach, even if you think that you could easily win that kind of complaint from a member. I think that's one thing that suggests itself. Another possibility that suggests itself is really the, agitation from the members themselves. If it's true that most members favor mandatory vaccination, which I think probably we'll discover when we undertake this research that that's probably true, then we might ask, why would union leaders kowtow, if you will, to the minority that don't want to get vaccinated rather than the majority that probably are happy to be working in an environment where they're confident that their colleagues are vaccinated? And I think here we might really be talking about something as simple as the squeaky wheel getting the grease. These kinds of decisions are fundamentally political. Vaccination mandates are fundamentally fraught. They're fundamentally controversial. And if you have a very vocal minority, and this is the kind of issue that invites a very vocal minority, and that minority is pushing for a compromise position, like maybe they're saying, hey, we will happily undertake testing in lieu of getting vaccinated, then that might matter more than a majority that maybe prefers a mandatory policy, but just isn't that fussed one way or the other, right? I mean, they're not the ones sending you these long, emails screaming about the Nuremberg Code. And so, even if you have a majority over here, if you have a very intense minority over here, that might kind of balance out where you think you need to go with your response to a vaccination mandate. No, of course, we know that even some unions have adopted, what I've called the third position, which is saying that even disclosure of vaccination status is problematic, that, the employer just doesn't have any business knowing your vaccination status. We've seen that among some police unions. They've taken that position. And the largest local of ATU, the Toronto local of ATU, has taken that position as well. I have to admit, I find this one really curious. It could be that in some particular unions, there is a very strong divide. But either way, it might be relevant that even if you are in favor of vaccination, that doesn't necessarily mean that you favor a mandate. So you could have, a union that has still, high vaccination uptake among its membership, but that there is a more, ideological predisposition toward saying that, even though it's a good idea to get vaccinated, it really is kind of a personal decision. And although I don't think much of that position, that might be what's working its way out with regard to those unions that are basically saying it's just none of the employer's business one way or the other. I think another possibility really has to do. My dog is very loud. I'm very sorry. I think the personal views of the union leadership is likely relevant as well. I think, for instance, if you are personally opposed, then that will color how you interpret and understand everything else, including, of course, the stuff that you're getting from your members. So I think those are some reasons that I'm hoping in some research to tease out about why union leaders might have taken sort of what seems to be the sort of middle of the road approach to vaccination mandates in their workplaces. There's also a fourth consideration here that I think is relevant, and that has to do with what a mandatory policy might mean for service provision. And I think that's an issue that is relevant not just for unions, but also for employers. So for instance, how many of those who object to the mandate might choose to quit their jobs rather than just get vaccinated? Now, it's really unclear how big a concern this actually should be. And certainly it's something that those who are against mandatory vaccination would have an interest in making a much bigger deal than it might turn out to actually be. We've heard, for instance, about nearly 4,000 healthcare workers in BC being put on unpaid leave for refusing to comply with a vaccine mandate. And as an absolute number, of course, 4,000 sounds really high. But if you take it as a percentage of the entire healthcare workforce, then that might contextualize that number a little bit better. And it might not seem to be, in fact, as big a number as it sounds, when you're just saying 4,000 people. Another part of that too is that, of course, we don't really know how many of those people who are like on an unpaid leave will actually risk getting terminated. I mean, there are going to be people who are going to push it to the limit, who will stay on an unpaid leave, but eventually will, succumb to the mandate because they don't fundamentally want to lose their jobs. And it's not a secret, or if it is, let me let you in on it, that vaccine mandates are coercive. That is the point of a vaccine mandate. So there's no real secret that some people will, in fact, fundamentally decide not to be terminated rather than face the vaccine mandate. So we don't really know how big a consideration that is, but that is something that, that is a consideration for unions, and I think quite rightly for employers as well. So with that, I want to just take another couple of minutes and then I will be done, I promise, to just talk a little bit about some takeaways from all this. So, the webinar was posited as, what does this mean for labor relations, and what kinds of things might it mean for labor relations in the future, on the idea that hopefully 2022 will see an end to the pandemic, and then there will be lessons to have been learned from it that hopefully we will take moving forward. And I think perhaps the most obvious one, but certainly I think the most obvious one, is that employers should not sideline the union when developing these kinds of policies. Now, as a general rule, I firmly believe that employers should meaningfully consult the unions in their workplaces. They should do so on, if I had my druthers, they do so on virtually every issue. I think it would save the union and the employer a lot of heartache, but they should certainly do so, even whether or not strictly required to do so by the terms of their collective agreements. They should certainly meaningfully consult with the union when there's a policy that's so clearly fraught for controversy, where the content is especially novel, right? As is the case here. And that absent that consultation, wherein if you had the consultation, you might be able to get agreement on the terms of a policy. Absent that agreement, you stand a much better likelihood of having to defend the policy at an arbitration. And so it doesn't make a lot of sense to me why you wouldn't, as an employer, really try to meaningfully engage with the union prior to all that happening. I think another takeaway is that employers and unions might want to consider having vaccination-specific language in their collective agreements. Now, of course, outside of the healthcare sector, it was virtually, not entirely, but virtually unheard of to have vaccine-specific language because, well, why would you, right? And I think obviously the pandemic has really changed that perspective. I think that the caveat here, though, is that collective agreement language can help or hinder, right? It cuts both ways. And so I think if you're going to go down the road of saying, you know what, we really should negotiate some vaccine-specific language into our CAs, you have to be really cautious because you don't want to negotiate something and then find out when you actually have to apply it 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. Hopefully never. But if it comes to it, that you've actually hemmed yourself in a way that you didn't intend. And of course, that happens all the time with collective agreement language. Otherwise, unions and employers wouldn't go to arbitration arguing over a different interpretation of the exact same language. So obviously that's true in all cases. But here, I think that's particularly a particularly relevant kind of consideration. And the third thing, and the last thing I'm going to say today, except for any questions that you might have, this is more of a sort of an observation, and I don't have any sense of how this will really play out. But I do, consider that even if some labor law principles are consistent, right? We have the same sort of principles, we apply them to particular fact scenarios, and those fact scenarios might be different. The actual understanding of certain kind of facts may also change. And so I'll just give you sort of an off-the-top example. I'm thinking of some previous arbitration cases that we did have in the healthcare sector with regard to seasonal flu and what were referred to as vaccinate or mask policies. Basically policies that didn't strictly say you had to vaccinate, but if you didn't vaccinate, then you had to mask, under certain kinds of conditions. And in some of these cases, and there weren't a lot of them, but in some of these cases, one of the things that came through was the idea that the policy was really trying to gear you to get vaccinated because wearing a mask was so onerous. And I just think that in this current context, the idea of wearing a mask being as onerous as it was thought to be, prior to the pandemic, is really an interesting kind of thought, because we know what our healthcare professionals have gone through in terms of things like mask wearing and suiting up with the PPE and such. And I just think that, thinking of surgical masks as being onerous is a really kind of pre-pandemic way of thinking about it. And I don't think we would necessarily look at that in the same way, having come through, what we've been through in the last 18 months. So those are kind of my thoughts for today. I will leave it at that. We are still really in sort of the beginning throes of how this will all play out over the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months. And then, of course, I think in the years to come. So I thank you very much for listening to me, and I will turn it over to Troy.
Okay, thanks. So there's quite a bit to unpack from everything that you said there. Certainly, as it was mentioned in my bio, CUPE is a very large union. We have 700,000 members. We have over 2,000 locals, and we are coast to coast, pretty much in every sector of the Canadian economy, with the exception of underground mining. We don't do that, but pretty much we're everywhere else. So just to speak a bit about our experience with this. Of course, as Alison mentioned, we were all just kind of going along, taking a kind of wait and see approach. And it was really that late August Friday afternoon when we got a bunch of us got a call from Transport Canada saying, oh, there's going to be an announcement. We have to have a meeting later. That's kind of when it all just kind of hit the fan. And from there, the dominoes really started dropping, across the country, even outside of the federal jurisdiction. And we started seeing the mandates really accelerate. A lot of us kind of thought, or at least within the health and safety world, I won't speak to the union generally, but within our health and safety frame, we expected mandates to come kind of later on once the vaccines had been moved from an emergency approval stage to a officially full approved stage. We felt like that was one of the things that if they tried to move too early and force people or to mandate people to get a vaccine, that a lot of folks would be able to say, look, this isn't even fully approved. It's only emergency approved. So like you're forcing me to do something that's not even 100% approved. So that was kind of, I think, part of the reason why we were just, from a health and safety perspective, saying, okay, well, we don't know how long this approval is going to take. And then, of course, those things were done shortly after. The Prime Minister came out with his announcement that late August, Friday. So that kind of changed the conversation a bit on itself. But I think that was one of the things that was definitely we were thinking in our minds. Now, of course, once that announcement was made, everyone really started coming out of the woodwork with their policies. To one of Alison's points, one thing I can say with quite a bit of certainty is very, very few of our locals had any previous conversations with the employer before the policy was rolled out. There was virtually no consultation or participation in the development of the policies. And I agree with Alison completely. Like, this is really something that I can't recommend enough. If you want to roll out something this big, you really should engage the workers and their union as early as possible in the process. You know what? You might not agree on everything, and then of course it's still up to the employer to do the policy that they want to do. And then let the battles begin if they're needed. But at least you'll know ahead of time kind of where the locals are where the unions are placing themselves, and what they've heard from their members, because that's the we certainly hear different things from our locals and from our members than what goes to the employer. And I would, once the policies of course started rolling out, all of our locals had to make their own decisions. Because CUPE, not all unions work like this, but CUPE is a union that believes all locals have their own autonomy. They choose what to do, in their own bargaining, in their own, what they grieve, what they bargain for. All of that is really left up. There's no central dictate from the national office that says thou shall do this, that, and the other thing. So it really came down to every local having to look at the policies that were put in front of them and say, could we even win a general grievance about this? Could we, does this appear on its face to be marginally reasonable, or is this kind of out there like way too harsh? And every local had to make that decision. And of course, we provided the best advice we could. Our legal team weighed in. I weighed in when relevant in the health and safety issues. And then they had to take that forward. And some locals decided that the way that the original policy was drafted up, that they felt it wasn't reasonable. It was either too harsh, too quick, too not fair. So they had some reason to which they believed they could grieve it. Whereas other locals, they said, no, this seems reasonable, and we're going to make sure, in fact, as Alison mentioned, that this is actually applied fairly. Or we disagree, we agree with your policy approach, but we disagree with the outcome. So maybe we believe everyone should be mandated, but we don't believe everyone, should actually be fired. or if they're going to be fired, a 1-week warning isn't sufficient, or literally every potential option for the mandate that could be put in the policy, I've probably seen within, I've looked at least 40 policies probably, and every kind of incarnation and option for what to do with somebody who has decided not to be vaccinated is in these policies. So, and some of them, when you're reading them, they're like, I'm thinking, oh, that might be okay. And some of them, you're just like, wow, where did they come up with that idea? So, so from that, and one of the, I don't want to ruin all your research, Allison. So, hopefully I don't give you the answer to your questions too early. But, into the question is, well, do the majority of people want a mandate? I do feel like that's probably yes. I think workers are in line with all of the research that we've seen come out. Like the majority of people do want to see some kind of a mandate. But where workers are really torn is what to do with the folks that don't have it, and that's really where the differences lie. Like, should a person be fired? Some people believe that. Should a person be put on leave? Some people believe that. Should a person be able to be tested every day? Some people believe that. Should there actually be a solid mandate? Well, there's 20% of the people who don't believe that as well. So it's not a matter of kowtowing or squeaky wheel getting the grease. It is about ensuring that everyone's rights are respected and that everybody has their opportunity to come forth and express their views around the reasonableness of the policy. Certainly, nobody in any position that I've worked with denies the effectiveness, the appropriateness, the usefulness, the importance of vaccination. And no court case that I am aware of, at least within the CUPE system, is arguing from the perspective that vaccines are a bad thing. And I have gotten those letters that you're referring to, threatening to take me to the Nuremberg trials. Probably about 40 or 50 of them. And that's unfortunate that there's kind of this cottage industry that's sprung up that's really, I believe, taking advantage of people's fears and really magnifying them in a way that's obviously not helpful. But that side of thing will work itself out. But the more, I'll call them potentially fruitful, or the ones that are more likely to be succeeding in a court, in an arbitration, it really will come down to the reasonableness. And I represent workers in airlines, which is having one discussion about what is reasonable. They're vaccinated for some things already. They have to fly to other countries, so there'll be different tests for what is reasonable and what is a reasonable solution to those who aren't able to be vaccinated or who don't want to be. Which is radically different than a worker who works for a municipality but has never actually had an office. They've always been a remote worker, and whether or not they have to be mandated to also get a vaccine. And it really does. It's going to come down to those conversations of reasonableness. And broad catch-all policies are useful for some organizations, but really, if they haven't engaged with the union to have those discussions, to really talk about kind of the impact, then that's how we find ourselves in these arbitrations. And of course, I like to say nobody wants that. I mean, no, we don't wake up in the morning looking to have to go to arbitration. Nobody wants that. So that is what it is. I had some other notes. On the health and safety perspective itself of vaccines. The one thing we should point out is, the vaccines are great, excellent, but they are just one of many risk mitigation factors that employers should consider. So obviously, if you're vaccinated, you are less likely to contract the COVID after you've been exposed. If you are sick, you are less likely to get to a point where you can spread it to other people. So these are both very good things. And again, that's what makes the vaccine so important, and why I would, again, constantly encourage anyone who doesn't have the vaccine. I would constantly encourage them to be vaccinated. But it's not the be all and end all of health and safety. This isn't if you're thinking of the classic hierarchy of controls, vaccines, at least for COVID, it's not elimination. This doesn't eliminate the virus. A vaccine mitigates your risk after you've been exposed. So if you've been exposed and you have the virus, then it will help you fight it. Your body has the instructions to not suffer as much as if you didn't have those antibodies already. So we really, if we're having that conversation around health and safety, we really do need to continue to focus on the prevention of infection, the prevention of exposure. And until we move past the point of having active community spread through all these work sites, we have to continue to, we can't think just because we got a mandate in that all of a sudden we can get rid of the rest of our health and safety controls. These things will remain important for quite a while. And there's some, hopefully some new thinking, around the ongoing infectious prevention and control mechanisms for infectious diseases. And you mentioned the previous vaccine or mask. The policy never should have been vaccine or mask, because if you're truly concerned about spreading the virus and it's the flu, it should really be get a vaccine if you want, but everyone still has to wear masks because the flu vaccine, unlike the COVID vaccine, is actually far less effective because of the level of mutations that occur within the flu. It's not as, again, I also encourage people to get the flu vaccine. Please don't take me as just in the flu vaccine. I got mine last week. I encourage folks to get it as long as they talk to their doctor and it's safe. Please get the flu vaccine. But it's far less effective. So hopefully we do shift our thinking. The one thing I'm hoping that COVID does for everybody, rather for or against a mandate, is to continue to think about infectious disease prevention as an ongoing thing that is only tangentially helped by vaccines. But vaccines aren't the be all and end all, and they won't. They certainly aren't going to be the thing that completely keeps us safe until we get out of this kind of constant community spread of the COVID. And I made a couple other notes in response. Oh yeah, that's the only thing I would say. I wouldn't call our responses tepid. I would call them reasonable. I've often been accused of being unreasonable in many of the things I have done. I would say our responses to these are reasonable. We haven't we've taken the time to go away and look at these vaccine policies from the full gambit before we decide. So I wouldn't use tepid. I would use reasonable. And I'll end my talk there and take some questions.
Great, thanks so much, Allison and Troy. I think there's lots there for us to kind of sink our teeth into. So what I'm going to suggest is we have some time for some questions and for the discussion. I suggest there's two ways. If you have a question to try and engage, you could either raise your hand. You can do that. You're all probably pretty Zoom experienced these days, but just in case you don't know, down in the reactions button, you can find a place where you can raise your hand, and then I'll call on you and you can turn on your camera and unmute and then ask your question. Or if you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can fire your question into the chat. I'll keep an eye on the chat and can read it out loud for you if you don't wish to unmute yourself. I think as we wait, and I'll maybe sort of get us started with a little bit of sort of news that came out this morning of the two postal worker unions are going to court to get an injunction on Canada Post's vaccine mandate. In particular, in their case, they're arguing that the Canada Post is only doing, you have to be vaccinated or you can't come to work, and there's no option in their particular policy for rapid testing. So I'm wondering if one or both of you are interested in commenting upon the dynamics that play around a policy that is just about vaccination, or that is vaccination and allows testing, and if that affects the reasonableness of that policy in any way.
So yeah, I can go first. Again, it will really come down to the specific aspects, and I work with the good folks at the Canada Post Union quite frequently, but I don't know all of the aspects of their workplace. So in some places that may be a completely reasonable option to help keep people protected from COVID. But in other places, it may not be. And this is what every, and, the decisions that came out last week, there was one about the Power Workers Union, which is, a CUPE local. That was the union's grievance was upheld because they looked at the very individual specific related effects of the existing policy versus the new policy, and said, no, in fact, what they're doing now is actually very good at keeping COVID out of the workplace. There hasn't been any outbreaks. Employers have been doing a great job. There's no reason to change their policy. So, the question is that an option? Yeah, it is an option. Is it reasonable? Well, that's going to really come out in the very specific facts as to how the workers interact and how what other protective things are in the workplace that either the employer has, not been able to do or been not willing to do. So can they increase the ventilation? Can they increase the physical distancing? Have they supplied everybody with the appropriate PPE? These are all conversations that are going to take place, I assume, at that ongoing arbitration.
Yeah, Jason, I'll jump in there. Thanks. Obviously, I think Troy has just said is really relevant to whether or not a policy might be upheld as reasonable. I'm not familiar with Canada Post's request for injunctive relief. I didn't catch that this morning, but I do want to make sure that it is clear that there have been a few cases of both unionized and non-unionized employees seeking injunctive relief through the courts. And I just think it's really important that we distinguish between the request for sort of like an interim injunction up until the point that the policies can be heard on their merits. And I think that's a really important distinction to make, because there have been, there have been about 3, I think, so far, cases where, unions and non-unionized employees have gone to the courts to seek injunctive relief. And the bar for, a court coming in and saying, I'm going to put a stay on the operation of this policy until such time we can, as we can actually hear it on its merits, is necessarily a high bar. And it has to be a high bar, because otherwise people would go to the courts to get injunctions against everything, right? Legislation, which people, do, and, obviously employer policies, what have you. And, one of the aspects is this question of irreparable harm. So if I don't put a stay on this policy until such time as it can be heard on its merits, will people actually suffer a kind of harm that can't be repaired or remedied after the fact? And so far, the courts have basically said, no, that isn't the case. And the reason it's not the case is because non-unionized employees can be fired for almost any reason at all. Like, it's not the same as being in a unionized environment. And so for them, if they get fired because they don't want to follow the employer's policy, the question really will be, should they have to get basically their severance and their reasonable notice? And that's a question that can be asked after the fact, right? They can go to court and say, okay, so I was fired, but I didn't get my severance, my reasonable notice. I'm due that, and now I want to get my money. You don't need to have an injunction in order for that to happen after the fact. And with regard to unionized employees, it's not dissimilar. If a union wants to challenge a policy in front of an arbitrator, which is where that would go, and the policy turns out to be unreasonable, then anyone who gets fired, will be reinstated. So there doesn't need to be an injunction in order to have the labor law principles and the employment law principles work the way they would otherwise do. I think the only caveat I have to that is that, of course, if a union doesn't choose to challenge an employer's policy in front of an arbitrator, then it could be that there are going to be, individual unionized workers who will be fired, and, they never got the opportunity to make their case in front of an arbitrator. But that is, again, part of how labor law works. Unions get to challenge policies in front of arbitrators, not individual unionized employees. And so whatever we might think of that, and it is kind of a live debate in the labor law community, again, that is the way it works in every other context, not just with regard to vaccination policies. So I don't think the claim that, a policy did not include, antigen testing would be an issue for injunctive relief. It might, however, like Troy, ably argued, it might be a question for whether or not the policy could be upheld as reasonable.
Great, thanks for that. We have a few hands up. I think the first one that I saw was Morgan Bello. Morgan, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you so much, Jason, for the organizing this and coordinating the debate and the conversation. Actually, Alison, thank you, and Troy, thank you. My question is probably seeing the future, right? We saw, at least I'm in Ontario, so we saw a great reopening plan that Doug presented this week, and obviously that create reactions about what is the future of the COVID vaccine, especially after, as Alison is saying, there are some unions that challenged, or they didn't, the fact that we put in some staff on leave of absence. So my question is more seeing in perspective. Let's say, what is the future of the COVID vaccine for 2022, considering that there is some hope that we don't have to see a 2022 with COVID, and they are talking about not wearing masks at the workplace, and probably it will not be required. So my question is probably in the practical point of view, how do you see that rolling out in reverse now, saying, well, we are no longer applying the COVID vaccine, and the implications for some measures that the employer took for staffing or for some grievance in place. So seeing that perspective, Alison, Troy, what do you see will happen if suddenly in March, at least, again, sorry for using that point as a reference, because probably I have colleagues across Canada, but at least in Ontario, they are suggesting March as March, April. So what do you see are the actions happening after that? Thank you so much.
So I think the one thing I've learned from COVID is thinking I can predict what's going to happen 4 months from now. It's probably a fool's game, because there's a lot of things we still don't quite know. But whether we're looking at March or whether we're looking at 1 year from now, will the there's still a lot of uncertainty as to the ongoing effectiveness of the existing vaccines that we have, and maybe tomorrow we get an announcement that there's a new vaccine that is even better than the the spike vax. Maybe Pfizer's been put to shame by how good this new vaccine is, or maybe we move into a state where this becomes completely endemic. We have to live with it like the common flu, and maybe we need boosters every 12 months or every 24 months. I would find it very hard to predict where we will be within this conversation without knowing the answers to those types of questions, because nobody, as much as we appreciate the importance of wearing masks and the importance of all the PPE, nobody wants to keep doing this for the rest of eternity. Nobody wants to have to wear a mask every time they go into work. Nobody wants to have to ride the elevator completely by themselves, or have their workplace capacities down to 50%, unless they've discovered, in fact, remote work is a better way of doing things. So I think until we answer those, I think it's going to be very difficult for us to specifically say that we have really any idea what to expect.
Yeah, I won't add to what Troy has said, because I think really it's just such I mean, I appreciate the question, I really do. I think it's such a changing terrain all the time. The only thing I will say is that I think that there have been some missteps made by governments that have too readily tried to predict when the end will be. Not only has that come back to bite them in the butt when they proved wrong, but I also think it sets us up for increasing polarization and division when it turns out perhaps that we actually do have to buckle down again, because there's a continuing fourth wave or the beginning of a fifth wave. I'm not really sure if we're in the beginning of a fifth wave or we're at the tail end of the fourth wave. But I do think that saying things like, I'm going to lift the vaccine mandate, in January, is the wrong message to send. And I think, trying to predict the end based on what we currently know is the wrong thing for governments to be doing. And it's setting us up for a harder time.
100%. 100%.
Great, thanks for that. Seeing the number of questions and kind of where we're at with time, I'm going to take 2 questions in a row, and we'll do 2 questions and then go toss to Allison and Troy. So Dion, do you want to ask your question?
So fabulous panel. Thank you so much for organizing to CIRA and CAWLS. Allison and Troy, my question is about precedent. And so I'm wondering, to what extent, when employers put these policies in place, if unions support them, let's say labor arbitrators even uphold them, is this setting a precedent for long-term vaccine mandates, and especially in the context of COVID, that boosters could be mandated if these are not challenged?
Great, thank you. And Marion, do you want to ask your question before we hand it over to Allison and Troy?
Yeah, I have both a question and a comment. My comment is, I think the only reason the postal unions are going to an arbitrator, it's not the courts, is because the Canada Post initially agreed to have rapid testing as an alternative to the vax mandate. And then they unilaterally reneged on that. That's the issue. And I think we have to understand that. But my question is, I think that when unions talk about vax mandates, you're talking about putting members off work, either on leave without pay or discharging them. And I think Troy talked a bit about it, but I think that puts unions in a very uncomfortable position. And I'd like some more discussion about that. Thank you.
Okay, Allison and Troy.
I'll jump in first if you want, Troy. You've been very good about doing the first 2. So with regard to the question on precedents, Dion, I think that, obviously it's still very, very early days. And we have seen, obviously, the 3 arbitration cases I know you're aware of. I know you've written about them. Your piece with Rafael Gomez was very, very good, by the way. I encourage everyone to read it. I think what we maybe thought would be the case, whereby, we all know we're in a pandemic. We all know pandemic is really bad. COVID is very serious. Our healthcare sector is in turmoil. We have these safe and effective vaccines. I think all those things are true. I think the arbitration cases that we've seen in the last few weeks have indicated that is the case. But that those facts won't provide all the cover or do all the heavy lifting with regard to vaccination policies, particularly mandatory vaccination policies, which are inherently more, intrusive into employees' privacy than, voluntary ones that really just require disclosure and testing. And even that, I think, might be subject to a successful challenge if we, have a declared end to the pandemic. So I think, all of these cases that we've seen are very context specific. And with regard to the, more difficult to defend, perhaps, mandatory policies, I think the 2 cases that we saw a couple of weeks ago, one case which upheld a mandatory vaccination policy and one which did not, I think what those were, particularly the one that did not uphold the mandatory vaccination policy, were really the workings of labor law principles that we already kind of know, on the idea that the employer, is required to demonstrate that it can't otherwise meet its legitimate safety and health concerns, as well as its legitimate business concerns. So whatever one might think about those cases and however much they can be critiqued, and they can all be critiqued, I don't think what we are actually going to be seeing is a strong precedent that employers can come around willy-nilly and impose vaccine mandates. I think they will still continue to be very, very context specific. And the particular context we have is, of course, its particular context. That might change once the pandemic is actually over. I just quickly thank you very much, Marion, for clarifying what Canada Post is trying to do. I wasn't aware of it. My comments about injunctive relief stand, but maybe they don't apply to Canada Post's situation. I think you raise, however, a very reasonable point and a very important point about, particularly when we're talking about termination of workers in the context of a pandemic that might very well be over in a few months. I'm not predicting. I don't care what the recording says. We'll go back to the recording. I'm not predicting that. But if it does turn out to be the case, and if it does turn out that there isn't going to be a lot of ability for employers to just sort of willy-nilly make vaccine mandates moving forward, then it becomes more difficult to justify terminating an employee, as opposed to just putting them on unpaid leave, for instance, in the context of a policy that might not even have any salience in 2 or 3 months' time. So I do think that particular part in particular is worthy of a lot of discussion. And I think it might be difficult to reasonably defend termination at this point.
Yeah, and to the point of precedent, I liken a lot of, I mean, obviously we're still very early days, but I see the same pattern starting to form as I saw when cannabis was first legalized. I've done a lot of work in the impairment, health and safety related aspects of impairment, so I pay attention to all of those court cases, and almost to a T, every single one of those decisions relies 98% on the exact context to which a various policy is being applied, and you are able to draw no broad conclusion from an arbiter's decision other than, boy, it mattered. The context mattered, and so I suspect many of the decisions will kind of follow that same flow. The context is going to be extremely specific, and as Alison just said, the context of the pandemic being over will drastically alter, because if you read the specifics of almost every arbiter, they make the point that we are living in extraordinary times, and extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures sometimes, and therefore, you know, that's where we are. That's why they're considering the way they are. So I do think that once we've left the extraordinary times, we'll be having different conversations. So and yes, to the it's always I never like to attempt to ascribe motive to anyone's particular actions. So the suggestion of why they're challenging, that absolutely could be. It was a critical part of the power worker union decision, you know, what was versus what became, so that you could absolutely be spot on with your interpretation of that. But I can't pretend to have any inside knowledge about the reasons behind, or their legal strategy behind that challenge.
We're a few minutes after the hour, but maybe with the willingness of our participants, we'll maybe take the last 2 questions as a batch, and then we can maybe move to roping it up. So,
no problem.
Nergarth, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, please. Thanks very much for the session. Very quickly, we're in a situation where, in spite of the good reasons for collaboration between the union and the employer that Alison laid out, we haven't had that experience. So my question is this: we have in our collective agreement provisions on leave without pay and suspension without pay, the latter which is disciplinary, and the employer is contending that in this particular case, what they're going to do is a leave without pay non-disciplinary that's not in the collective agreement, and so therefore is management rights. And I just would like your expert view or commentary on how unusual that is to have an employer arguing that that they have to basically unilaterally write a new article of the collective agreement in order to operate in this context.
Great, thank you. And Ian, do you want to toss out your question, and then we'll go to the panelists one last time?
Thank you. Thanks very much. Just a comment and then a question. I'll try and make them both quick. One is I want to talk the fact that context matters. I agree with Troy, and also that means tactics matter too, because the context changes. For instance, and I'll try to be quick, we didn't campaign for a vaccine amongst our members. We leaned on the employer. We wanted them to introduce it, not us, because we're not the employer. And and we were opposed to testing because we wanted them to introduce a vaccine mandate. They introduced the vaccine mandate, and we suddenly became in favor of testing. So our tactic changed as the situation, and I think we sort of stand by that shift. The thing is this: the government is in the background. The role of the government is important. Everyone's saying the government's empowering the policies, and the guidelines from the Human Rights Tribunal have basically put paid a lot of claims for creed and other philosophical claims for exemption, and that's really important. And in terms of tactics and in context, the government at any time can come in and change the whole context of this and make what isn't acceptable now acceptable. So we're wondering, I think, whether it's worth putting too much stock in legal niceties and such like, when the government can come and remove it all and just make what's not allowable, and how one deals with that.
Great, thank you, Troy and Allison.
I can start with the government one, because of course that was what kind of threw us for a tizzy when the Prime Minister came out 2 days before the election and said, we're going to mandate this in our airline division. It's always important to look at the details, and for us, yes, they mandated that everybody who's going to operate on a plane be vaccinated. Not every passenger that gets on the plane be vaccinated. But at least, outside of the Federal Public Service, he didn't mandate, and the government still hasn't mandated what the employer's actual options are for those who aren't vaccinated. And I think it's fairly rare. Like the government of Ontario could come out tomorrow and say all healthcare people have to be vaccinated, or else. But they'll never say, likely, I mean, maybe they will. They do some bold things sometimes, but it's unlikely that they'll say what is that or else part. So hopefully, I mean, fingers crossed on that level of government intervention. Hopefully that's where we'll always be able to have those conversations with the employer. I don't know if Allison has anything else to think on that one.
I guess the only thing I would say is that, I mean, the fact is governments, for the most part, and of course there are different governments across the province, I can't, in one small, thing, speak about every single one of them. But for the most part, governments have been very loath to actually create mandates of any kind. And certainly in Ontario, although we have seen a few directives, directed toward particular sectors, for the most part, they have been directives for those sectors or employers in those sectors to create essentially voluntary vaccination policies, with the caveat that if the individual employer chooses to do something more robust, then they're permitted to do so. So I don't think that, although it's true that governments could come in and mandate things more robustly than they have, in fact, they largely should have, in my view, done that way back when, and not left it largely to individual employers to try to do their own risk burden analysis. For the most part, I don't think we were ever really going to see that. For the most part, we haven't seen that. And for the most part, even where they have done something, what they have done has been very much the middle of the road approach anyway. So, I don't know what to say other than, obviously that would be a new, thing for unions to have to potentially respond to. It would certainly in some ways take off a lot of responsibility from unions, because they wouldn't bear the responsibility to, go to arbitration over their employer's policy. Although invariably someone would take the government to court over some kind of charter violation if they were to put something in that was more robust. So these are the sort of changing terrains that we're dealing with. And I think that's very consistent, in fact, with what Troy said anyway.
And just before we wrap up, I don't know if you saw, there are two questions in the chat. The first one was around just communications and unions and employers. And I wanted to just throw in, around a lot of things related to this pandemic, there has been increase in the amount of communications the unions have had. Just, again, I'll use my airline division, like, the large swings of employment back and forth, the CERB program, the various other things. That has instigated a number of conversations, obviously, with the executives and the employer. So I'm not saying it's positive that we had a global pandemic, and that's increased the relationship of the employer and the union. I wouldn't go that far, but there has certainly been probably more conversations around a lot of those complex issues around, you know, the hirings, the layoffs, all of that stuff. But to this particular topic, vaccine mandates, no, it really hasn't. This hasn't really increased the the employers have, and this isn't just airlines, this is kind of all over. The employers have put their policies out, said this is what it is. If you don't like it, we'll see you at grievance. That's kind of the place, at least from what the feedback I'm hearing. And as to a country, you know, trying to mandate something when the population hasn't had a chance to be vaccinated, I think that's wholly unfair. You know, finally, you know, so happy, you know, our children can now, you know, 5 to 11 can now be added to the vaccination list. My 2 kids are getting, two of 3 of my kids can get it on Friday, and I'm just super stoked. And the government's saying, well, no, we're not going to mandate kids getting on airplanes to be vaccinated. And of course they can't, because the vaccine just came out, you know, yesterday for kids. But I almost guarantee you that, you know, 6 to 8 months from now, in kind of the same time period as they gave for the original vaccine, we're going to start to see those kind of rules applied to the smaller children as well. Rather that's a school mandate, I don't want to predict, but we will see those types of. I can almost for sure predict that's going to happen. I would not bet a large sum of money because I'm not a betting man, but if I had a little, you know, little spending money to throw around in a bet, I would bet that, you know, 6 to 8 months out from now, we will see those type of mandates for the children. So no, it's unreasonable to mandate a population that hasn't had the ability to be vaccinated.
With that, if I could just jump in for a second there, Jason, because I want to make sure that Kirk's question also gets addressed. I think, Kirk, if I understood you, you were asking a question about this idea that employers making stuff up, if I can say, with regard to sort of this new pathway, because the collective agreement as it was, you know, negotiated doesn't fit well with what, you know, they currently want to do. And I will say that of the 3 arbitration cases that, you know, we've talked about a little bit here, one of them, it was a PWU and OPG, I think, there was in fact this very question about whether or not the employer could put people on unpaid leave at a certain point in the process when the collective agreement contemplated not being able to do that. And I think the arbitrator's response to that was something along the lines of, these are unusual times. If we were to operate according to the strict letter of the agreement, we would literally have people not being tested and in the workplace until such time as we can go through the entire process and determine that they had, you know, committed, you know, actual disciplinary action and could be put on unpaid leave. And so, you know, these extraordinary times are going to make us say that in this particular context, yes, you can put them on unpaid leave, you know, until such time as they're willing to be tested according to the policy. And so I do think it is not unreasonable, again, very cognizant of the circumstances, to say that some things that employers and unions negotiated that would otherwise apply cannot apply because the circumstances were simply not in the contemplation of the parties at the time. And sometimes, in order to come to, you know, the reasonable conclusion, you have to do novel things. And so I think that there is actually already some precedent for that idea, and I think that idea does make some sense. Parties can't always be held to things that they could not have contemplated because it was completely outside of their experience at the time.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for that. Let me wrap things up by thanking once again our 2 speakers, Troy and Allison. I think this was a fabulous sort of discussion. You brought in some wonderful insights. I think the goal of WIS was to try and bring out some of the subtleties and complexities about this, and I think you did a wonderful, fantastic job of leading us through that. So thank you so much on behalf of both CIRA and CAWLS for your willingness to do this with us today. And a thank you to all of you who attended. We appreciate taking a little bit of time out of your day to come and have a discussion about this. And we hope to, CIRA certainly hopes to have in the new year some other webinars kind of continuing along in our equity, diversity, and inclusion series. And I know that, you know, CAWLS also is looking at some programming in the new year. So keep your eyes peeled on both websites and both email lists, because we have some interesting things coming. And enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you.